So welcome to this, I think, last session of the day. I'm always a little bit amazed about Russian conferences because they seem to start quite late, but they also run quite late. And I'm more of a morning person, so for me it almost feels like midnight, although I'm in almost the same time zone. But anyway, in this session we'll have a look at how we can do application diagnostics using the cloud. And more specifically, we'll be looking at the Azure Application Insights service and the client SDK to see how we can do diagnostics of applications not only running in the cloud, but also applications like mobile applications or anything that runs in a different data center from Azure. But we'll just use the service to see, to look into the details of what we can do there. So the agenda for today is I'll talk a little bit about logging and diagnostics and how logging and diagnostics currently in a lot of situations is not ideal or even terrible to work with. Once we set that on the side, we'll have a look at how App Insights or Application Insights can help you solve that. We'll look a little bit at the service itself, because that's eventually where your data will end up and what we want, and where we will consult the data that we are sending up there. But I also want to focus a little bit more on the client side, so the diagnostics collector side that you put in your application and how you can send more data and better data to Application Insights so you get real value out of that service. And then there's one additional service, App Insights Analytics, which basically gives you the ability to query whatever data you are uploading to Azure App Insights and gives you a lot of potential in that you can write your own queries against the data that you put up there and really figure out what is going on in your application. So let's go. What's going on? Typically, when I see a lot of codes, and you probably have seen this in your code as well, you use a logging framework or a diagnostics framework to write stuff into a log file or an event store somewhere. So typically, you would see some things like this. The first one is not really useful because it just says something happens. But I see a lot of developers do this because developers, they know they should be logging, but a lot of developers don't log correctly. They don't log what is really interesting, and they just start doing what you do with code comments, where you say, this should be true, and then the next line says false or something like that. So logging is not ideal. Second example is a little bit more interesting and more useful because it clearly states we have an error, and at least we get the exception message. But still, we miss a lot of information. There's no stack trace, there's no memory dump or whatever. I have no idea on where this exception occurred and what the exception really is about. I only have the message to go on, and that's probably not what we want. Turns out we are not alone. If you open up any random log file on your Windows system, for example, you will see log files like this. There's the name of the application. That's good, because I know which application did the logging. We get a timestamp, that's also useful. We get a verbosity, informational, error, warning, and things like that. And then we get a number. I have no idea what the number is. Typically, these numbers correspond to thread IDs, but even then, if I look at this thing in 2 weeks from now, I have no use for the fact that it was thread ID 8 throwing an exception in this log file. So it's not really useful information. Then if you really look at the log file itself, you will see that, for example, the null reference that we have there, it's nice because we can discover there is a null reference in our application, but we have no idea where it happened, which line of code, what was the application doing, what was the input to the application. I have no idea. So the only thing that I know is there's a null reference exception. It happened at this time. If I know my application well enough, maybe I can figure out where it happened and why it happened, but probably not. There's a couple of other really nice examples in there. Verbose logging, you typically do if you want to add more information to the log file that you have. In this case, this came from a real log file from some application on my machine. The verbosity says basically run engine, action, nothing, and command line, and a bunch of asterisks. It's not useful. If this is your log, don't log. I think there's no use in having anything like this. Well, probably it's better than nothing, but still it's not going to really help you in figuring out what is going on in your application. So is this helping? Absolutely not. So log files, I'll say it like it is, they suck in the current form where they are just stupid string data. A typical log file also has no context. You get a thread ID or something like that, maybe an application name and a timestamp, but that's typically it. You also get not a lot of correlation data. You don't know what was the memory usage, what was happening on the CPU, which inputs were there, you have no idea. It's just stupid strings, and whatever people put in there is what you will get, and if this data they put in the log file is not sufficient, you have no idea what is going on. Luckily, there's a lot of smart developers in this world that came up with semantic logging and frameworks like Serilog and so on. Who's not familiar with semantic logging, by the way? So the idea there is that you provide context in your log files, and if you don't just write it to a text file, you will get additional context in a database or whatever store you are using to store this data. Log files typically also don't contain information about the machine. Your code runs somewhere. Very often, and probably most often, the bug that you are facing will be caused by some input or something that is happening in the application, but maybe memory usage is really spiking at some point, or CPU usage is spiking, a garbage collection is happening, or something like that, and that is causing your application to fail. If you just do stupid string data, you don't have that information. Of course, we can solve this again. There's tooling in Windows Server, we have New Relic, there's PRTG, SNMP, all kinds of things that you can do to get this information, but still, you have to set up all the infrastructure to get all this additional context with your log files. How do you get the data of your machine? Imagine you have a cluster of 100 machines, they all run your application. How do you get log data and contextual information from those 100 machines on your log analytics tool? Again, there's vendors that have tooling for that, there's New Relic, there's a couple of other options to do this, but still it's a lot of work to get that data off the machines. And then there's the next thing. You get the data of the machine, how do you analyze everything? There's a lot of people I see using Splunk, some use Logstash and then feed everything into Elasticsearch, then use Kibana to do reporting and so on. But all I really wanted in my application was good logging, knowing what is going on in my application. I don't really care about the fact that I have to spin up 50 Logstash machines just to be able to parse all the logging that we have throughout the day. No, I just want my logs and I want to be able to look at them. So all of this basically makes log files suck a little bit. Analytics suck. There's vendor tooling for a lot of things. Windows Server, for example, has tooling. On Linux, there's a lot of tooling. But very often, they are limited to just a platform that they are built for. So a lot of the Windows Server tooling, for example, will not work if you have Linux things running .NET Core, for example. If you do everything on Linux with .NET Core, then your Windows Server tooling will not work, etc. So that's not ideal. So a lot of people build it themselves, and that's perfectly fine. We're all developers, and I think we like building stuff ourselves. But the core business value of what you are building is probably not building a logging infrastructure. It's going to be building your application that you want to ship. So again, it's not ideal. We can all do this, but it's not ideal. So to the rescue, Application Insights on Azure. So Application Insights is, in a very, very expensive words, it is an application performance management service for web developers and other developers that want to do something. What does this mean? It basically gives you logging, it gives you contextual information about where your application is running, and the analysis services to make sense of the data that you are feeding into it. So Application Insights, it is an Azure service. It's not a service that you can run in your own data center. You have to use the cloud for it. So that also means that all the data that you want to put into this system has to traverse the internet somehow. It's a service, and it's a library and an SDK that allows you to feed information into this system in Azure. The nice thing about Application Insights is that it stores where to store, how to get the data off the machine, and so on, because all those components are already in the SDK and available in the service that you can use online. An interesting thing is that Application Insights not only takes your logging data, but it also takes CPU usage, memory usage, it uses ETW, it tries to check out which queries that you are executing on the machine if you have a database connection and so on. And it correlates all that data together so that you can see if you have a null reference exception somewhere, that you are able to figure out why this null reference exception was happening, and maybe even can find the exact database query that went to the database and eventually came up with that null value that caused it to crash. Nice thing is, I can go into this portal and look what's going on in my application, but I can also set alerts in the in App Insights. So if I want to be alerted when more than 5 null reference exceptions occur after a deployment, I can do that and get that information in my mailbox and so on. What I really want to stress, the service is in the cloud, and I see most developers use the service together with web applications and so on, but you don't have to use web applications. It can be a Windows application, it can be Xamarin, it can be an iOS application, Angular, Vue.js, or whatever you want to build in terms of frameworks that you use to build your application. As long as they have outbound HTTP access to Application Insights, you can make use of the service. Right. App Insights, like I said, is mainly 3 components. There's the middle one, Application Insights, the big black box that you feed data. And you feed that data from different components and different parts of your application. So if you have, for example, a web application, you will install an SDK into the application. The SDK will look at whatever is going on in the HTTP level. It will try to look at maybe web APIs that you are using. It will look at the database statements, etc., and will make use of all that information and push it into Application Insights. Application Insights does some processing on that, and then you can use other components to get the data out. So let's look at a couple of these things. So if you want to get started with Application Insights, of course, you will need an Azure subscription. And once you have that, you can go and create a new Application Insights service. I already did this because it takes a couple of minutes to spin one up. So this is an almost empty Application Insights I created this morning. I can click through and I can see all the different operations that happened, how long they took on average, and I can even look into the details or select a period in time if I'm interested in what happens during this period of time. What I get then is all the operations that happened in my application. I can see, did they take longer than normal, were there more than normal, and so on. And if I want, I can even select one operation and look at several of the samples, look into the details, and get an entire end-to-end transaction of what was going on during this request. This was a simple one. It's just the call to my homepage and no dependencies. But if you have database calls, for example, you actually get all the database calls there as well. If you call into external HTTP APIs, you will also get those calls in there. And I can even go further and look at, for example, custom data or what was the response code of this, and even search for response codes like this. I can find related items. So for example, everything that this specific user has been doing on my website, so that I can quickly find what was happening in my application. Yeah, that's it. So that's a lot of things that you already get out of the box by just creating the service and installing the SDK. So I'll look at the SDK now. The SDK is basically one NuGet package that you have to install. So if you look at your NuGet packages in the project here, we will find, if Rostelecom didn't block it, yes, it works. We will find that it's basically just this package that I have to install into my application. This thing does everything. It comes with a client-side and a server-side thing for ASP.NET, but if you look on NuGet for just Microsoft.Application Insights, you will also find Xamarin Forms and other SDKs that you can use to work with the service here. So I installed that. There's one thing I need to send data to Application Insights. They have to know which application I am. So if you look at the portal, you have this instrumentation key. I will need to paste that into my configuration file so that Application Insights can pick it up. Not there yet. I also have in my ASP.NET Core application, I have to register a service, which is the Application Insights Telemetry. forget about these for a minute. I'm actually going to delete them. I just have to add one line, and that does all the server-side stuff. So it will track all the server-side things. It will try to see which entity framework queries that I'm running, and so on. Right. If I have that, I will only get server-side information. I will also need some client-side stuff. So in my layout CS HTML, what I added is a little snippet of JavaScript, which is this thing. html.raw javascript snippet.fullscript. This is also a static variable property that Application Insights gives us, and that will render a piece of JavaScript that will send the client-side data to Application Insights. So that's, in a nutshell, how you can get it set up. Right. Do you have to run on Azure? Again, no. The service is on Azure, of course. The analysis service is on Azure. But you basically have a REST API that you can send data to. You can do it yourself, or use one of the many SDKs for web, for Xamarin, for .pf, for Windows services, or whatever that you want to be using. If you're using IIS to host your applications, there's an agent that you can install on the left there that will send additional data about the server to Application Insights. If you're using Docker, for example, you can install one Docker host on one Docker machine on your Docker host, and that one will also collect information about all the running containers, so that if some exception happens, for example, you can correlate it with the container that it was running in and what the status of the Docker host and so on was. So that's a really interesting one to add as well. Right, let's look a little bit more in detail at the service and then go into the client-side things. So let's focus on the right-hand side there. Application Insights, I already showed you this, has a lot of data that we can work with and explore, but there's a lot more that we can do with this. I have to go into the portal to look at this data and to discover what is going on in my application. It would be nice if App Insights could tell me when something is happening, and App Insights actually does that. So let's go to a more interesting one that has a lot more data. What I get is a couple of things that provide me with additional information. So first of all, I can set, let's search for alerts. I can set alerts on certain events that happen in my application. So for example, I can add a new alert rule that says if from my web application here, I can add some criteria where I can say, okay, if some saved query or something like that occurs more than 3 times, send me an alert. I can add alerts there. It's really interesting. Imagine you are doing a deployment after a big refactoring. Maybe you want to monitor CPU usage and memory usage to see if your application is actually behaving better or maybe even worse, so that you get an alert if some things happen in your application. These alerts are nice. You can go all in and you can do a lot of things with those. But Application Insights also has another interesting aspect, which is smart detection. I can again set alerts, but also Application Insights will set alerts for me. So there's a couple of rules that it uses to detect certain types of events in an application. So for example, we can see that it detected that 2 days ago, I had a 1500% increase in HTTP request validation exceptions in my application. I didn't have to do anything for this, just install the SDK, and App Insights found that I had more exceptions than normal on a Friday. And it will give me the properties, like what was the most common property of this event, when did they happen time-wise, what exceptions occurred, and I can look at the detected exceptions and get more data about what really happened in there. Nice thing is, I get this in the portal, but it will also send me an email when this happens. So it will send me an email when I have more than this specific amount of exceptions than normal. And I get all that information in the portal. It does that on exception volume. It also does this, for example, on potential memory leaks. That's a nice one. It will also monitor memory. And as you can see here, memory rises and then falls and then rises again and then falls. It really looks suspiciously like a memory leak, and it will inform me that maybe I should start profiling and look into what is going on in my application. Suspicious user activity. They also look at, for example, if you have a login system in your application and you have a username system, and you see the same user login from different locations around the globe, it will also alert you about that kind of activity. Why? Because the data is there. It's not just a simple log file. You have a lot of contextual data that it can use to determine this kind of things. So that is a really nice thing. What else is there? There is the live stream, which is kind of an interesting one. If you have an application, typically when you get a support call or something, you want to see what is going on in the application, but from a very, very high level. So what this live metric stream gives you is exactly that. It shows you the incoming requests, outgoing requests, overall health and CPU, and the number of requests that are coming in. And immediately here, I should be able to see if, for example, my exception rate rises, and then dive into more details. So that's an interesting one. On the same database, it can also build an application map. So I can look at my application, and App Insights actually tries to figure out how my application is structured. So this application is basically a web application and an API that has clients that can be both API clients as well as browsers, and it uses table storage on Azure. And that's exactly what you can see in this Application Insights map. I have some clients, and I can look at client-side errors by drilling down and get more details about the client-side errors. I can open this and see what is going on. It's a bit slow. On the other hand, I can also look at, for example, the calls that go to table storage, and I can see which accounts are being called. And again, I can look at, for example, the slow calls to table storage and see what is going on in terms of the speed of the dependencies that I'm calling. I do this now with table storage, but if you have a SQL server, for example, you will get similar information. You will get the same drill down where you can drill down into a SQL server, look at slow queries and things like that. So that's, again, by just installing this SDK into your project. One interesting thing, if you cannot find the data that you want in any of these views, there is an additional option that you can use, and that is the continuous export. So by default, App Insights stores all the data into its own data store to be able to query things. But imagine you want to run your own analysis afterwards. You can add a continuous export and basically dump all the data you send into App Insights into a table storage or a blob storage account on Azure. So you can also run your own analysis. And that's also pretty interesting, because if you do that, and I've done that for this application, you can build, for example, a Power BI dashboard where you can look at, for example, how fast my API calls are for a certain type of client. Where are most API calls coming from? Because I get location information as well. How fast are they on average? I can even drill down and say, okay, I'm interested in maybe the 409s, the conflicts. Well, I can filter in Power BI, and again, on this continuously exported data, I can get a lot of information. So App Insights does a lot of things for free for you. Well, not for free, you pay for the service, of course, but there's a lot of options that come inside the box. And if those are not enough, you can still build your own dashboard on top of the data that you export from it. But the capturing is also quite valuable already. Right. So that's, in a nutshell, the processing the data side. Now, there's data ingestion. Like I said, if you look at the Getting Started pane, data can come from performance counters from the requests, both client-side and server-side, traces, dependencies, custom metrics, or whatever type of data that you want to put into there. And on the other hand, you can analyze, monitor, query, have automatic detections of stuff, and so on. Now, when you have all of that, you can do a lot of things, but we can do better. And that's the next part. We'll look at the developer side, how we can feed better data into Application Insights to make it work better for us. So let's focus on the left part, where we send the data off to Application Insights. So we've seen that we already get a lot of data that is automatically collected by just installing the SDK, but we can do a lot of additional things. So one is better tracing. You can still use system.diagnostics.trace and trace strings into Application Insights, but if you use Serilog or the ASP.NET Core logging framework or something like that that has semantic logging, you can actually see the properties that are in your semantic log as well. Search on them, filter on them, and that's quite useful. We can send custom events and custom metrics to Application Insights as well. So Imagine we are interested in having a metric that shows us at any point during the day how many people are currently adding items to their shopping carts. That's a nice metric to have, and I can write a metric in Application Insights to send that data off to the service, and I can add a nice counter to my dashboard that correlates exceptions with the amount of orders that are happening on my website. I can send additional data when exceptions happen, and I can also plug into the telemetry pipeline to do really interesting things like filter data or even enrich the data more. So there's a couple of things that we can do there. So first of all, better tracing. Stupid strings, try to forget about them. If you're just using system.diagnostics.trace, maybe go for something that does semantic logging, because if you do that, you can send that type of data to Application Insights. And you can filter on that, query on that, search on that, and so on. If you're not using any of those frameworks yet, or you're using nlog, for example, what you can do is write your custom adapter for App Insights and send the data using the App Insights SDK to your App Insights service. So let's look at what better tracing can do. So in my application, I have the account controller. And in my account controller, I'm not really doing a lot of things. The only thing that I'm doing is when a login is happening, I'm logging information saying logged in and then the username. This is semantic logging in action. I'm actually telling the logging framework, like, look, this is the string. You can populate the string with the email of the user that has logged in. But if the system listening to this data supports storing this thing separately, please store it separately. That's in a nutshell what we are doing here. If we do that, we send this data off to Application Insights. I configured Application Insights to also collect these logs. Again, one line of code to do that, but if we do that, we get some interesting things in the server side. So let's run my application for a little bit. Sometimes you will see me talking for about a minute and then show what is happening in the portal. The reason for that is it takes about 1 minute up to 5 minutes sometimes before new data shows up. So I already did a couple of things so that I have something to show you, but just so you know, it's not real time. It's almost real time. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So let's log into our application. I can log in with my username and password, log in, and I'm logged in. Nothing really fancy in the application. But if we go to App Insights, there's actually a lot of things that we can find. So we can search for things, and we know that logging in, we know our application, of course, we know that logging in emits the string logged in. So let's search for that string, and we will see that we find our traces. We will see that we find the log traces that we did to Application Insights. We can dive into them, and we can see the full string, including the email address. But what we also get is some enriched data. I'll show you how the developer came in and a couple of the other ones came in at a later point in time. But we can see that the username that we passed in our string message in Visual Studio is populated here. And I have an additional property that I can query on. I can add alerts. For example, if I see that a specific user logs in more than 50 times per minute, send me an alert. I can do something like that because I now have the username by just doing semantic logging. I told you correlation is very important in Application Insights, and I now have a trace statement. Wouldn't it be nice if I could go from this essentially simple string log statement to what request was going on? Well, I can do that. I have my user ID, so I can see whatever this user did. I have my session ID, so I can see what this user did during a session. Or I can just look at, let's go back. I can also look at all available telemetry for this operation. And in this operation, we can see that we had a number of trace statements. And for some reason, my actual requests are not in there, but normally you would also see the requests in here. So you would see that we actually went to the login page, that this controller did its stuff, and so on. So I will get all that information. Let's try another one. The data should be there. No, for some reason. Anyway, let's look at a full user session so you get an idea that you can also look at page views, the actual trace that is in there, the request, and so on, and you can basically follow the entire path of what the user has been doing during a specific request. which is really nice. It's way better than just that string data that we had before. So that is one that we can do. Now let me check if there's anything else that I should show here. No, not really. So I showed you that you can trace, you can do semantic logging, and you can emit, for example, the username and so on in there. And remember that you also get an automatically generated user ID and session ID, so I can see what this user has been up to during his time on our application, and I can even see how long certain requests took and so on. So for example, I can see they went to the home page, then did a login from St. Petersburg, Russia. That's, again, data that I get by just having that SDK in there. Right, back to this. Good. The next thing that we can do, we've seen how we can send string data, and it's really as simple as hooking up your logging framework to Application Insights. The next thing is more interesting. We can send custom events and metrics to Application Insights. What do they look like? Typically, a string that identifies the metric or the event, and a value. In the case of custom events, your value will be a string. In the case of metrics, the value will be numeric, because you want to track something that is not just an event, but really is a counter. So events, why would you use them? Typically to figure out what is going on in terms of usage of your application. I'll give you an example in a minute. The big application that I have has events for every single feature that we have. So if you use a specific feature in the application, we log an event that this feature has been used. So I know this user has been using this feature and it failed or it succeeded or something like that. So you can do things like resizing of the UI, clicking on a certain button and things like that. Those are typically events. Metrics help you measure quantifiable data. So for example, if I want to see how many items are in all of the different shopping carts of all the different users that are currently on my e-commerce website, I can add a metric that sends that number to Application Insights, and Application Insights will automatically aggregate all that data for me and give me a nice metric to show that data. So let's see how that is done. This one, I had to do a little bit more in there. But if I go to my shopping cart controller, it's still fairly easy. So what I'm using is the telemetry client from Application Insights SDK, and I'm importing that as a service into my controller. How do I get this thing as a service? Well, in my startup, I added Application Insights telemetry. That thing is actually registering the telemetry client as well. So again, by just adding this one line, I get dependency injection for the telemetry client as well. Now, when I have that one, I can do certain things with it. So for example, I can say track an event. My event will have a name, so whenever someone adds an album to their shopping cart, I want to track that they are using the add item to shopping cart feature. So I'm tracking that event. My event can also have metadata. Even though my album added will be the same event, for regardless which product that I have in my e-commerce store here, what I can do is also annotate it with the album ID, because maybe I want to see which albums get more added to a shopping cart than other albums. I can do that with App Insights, so I can send the data. I'm also tracking a metric here, and I'm basically just increasing the shopping cart.albums in cart with 1. Because that increments the metric, and App Insights will aggregate everything and give me a nice counter in the portal. I have similar codes in the remove from cart action here. Whenever I remove something, I'm falsely tracking the album added, so I should probably remove that. But what I'm doing is tracking that metric again, and if I still have items in my cart, I just remove them all, and otherwise I just do a -1, again, because the service will do the aggregation for me. What does this look like? Well, in my store, again, I can add items to my cart. Let's add this one. Let's go to my store again. Let's add this one. Then remove this one, and maybe remove another one, or I'll just keep it around. If we do that, we can go to the portal and look at the metrics and the events. So events, the first thing here, will contain everything that happens on my application. Now do note, a page view is also an event, so those will be displayed here as well in a web application. But what I can see is, for example, give me everyone who did a shopping cart.album added, and I can see they all came from an undefined country, which is probably going to be when I was on a VPN. And I can see 3 users have been doing the album added event, so I can do some metrics there. If I have these metrics, I can also look at funnels. That's a more interesting one. I can look at, for example, who went to the homepage, for example, and then who added an album, and then of those people who actually went to a checkout, because that's another event that I'm tracking. And I can see a nice funnel of how people have been using my application and how certain features have been used in the application. So it's not just the page views, I have the custom events that I can correlate again and look at how many people actually did a checkout. Now again, I can also look at the checkouts, and if I would search for this event, I would be able to see where there may be exceptions why people didn't do a checkout or something like that, and figure out why people haven't been using this specific feature. The metrics are there as well. I can look at my metrics explorer, and for example, add a chart of the amount of shopping cart albums in my shopping cart. So you will see there's 2 yellow spikes on there. That was when I was testing earlier today. You can see that I've had more items in the cart than items were removed and added again, removed again, and so on. And probably in 5 minutes, we'll see the ones that I just did in the application. So again, I can send metrics to the application, and I could even correlate them with data that I already have in there. So I now have my shopping cart.albums in shopping carts, but I could also correlate those with, for example, the browser page load time. Maybe that's something that I want to see. I cannot. Let's try that. Why isn't this working? Anyway, normally you should be able to click that button. Probably have to reload the page here. But normally you would be able to see, okay, this metric went up because my page view load time went down, for example. So you can start optimizing the UI load time because it's proven almost that it sells more albums, things like that. To give you a nice example, I also have an application Insights that has way more data in it. In this application, we are not using metrics, but we are using the events for pretty much every feature that happens in the application. And I get a nice chart of any events that happens. So I can see today we had 2 new users being created. Those users, well, at least some people also created a new feed in the application, someone did a login, someone created a service hook, someone created a build source in this application, so I can track all the events that I have, see which features are being used, and so on. Again, interesting here could be to look at the funnel of people who, let's say, create an account, create a new profile, and then create a new feed, because that's what this application does. I want to track how many people are registering versus how many are actually starting to use the application. Well, I can see it in here by just tracking those events. Right, any questions so far? No? Okay. The next thing, exceptions. I hate exceptions, and I think everyone hates exceptions, but there's no way around it. There will be exceptions in our codes. So instead of looking at something happened and it destroyed our application, let's try to make them more pleasant and get some more information. First of all, we've seen when we just do string data, we can log the message and maybe the stack trace, but it's not really helpful. Ideally, we want to have and a stack trace and perhaps even a memory dump of what was going on, which values were in memory when this certain exception happens. Well, App Insights allows you to do that, and I'll show you how. So first of all, I'll show you what happens when an exception happens in my music store application. When that happens, I can look at the failures in my application. So I can look at the failures here, click through, then I get which action failed and so on. And at some point in time, I will get my entire trace of whatever happened. So my entire end-to-end transaction of what happened. I had a page view, and this page view through 2 exceptions. I can look into the exceptions, but what's more interesting is that these exceptions have this nice symbol, which means that they have a mini dump attached to them. So I can look at this exception, I can open a debug snapshot, and I can get a lot of information like the current call stack. If it loads at some point, it's analyzing. The current call stack, the variables that were in memory, and a lot more. And I get those in the browser, but it looks like that's going to take a couple of days before that loads. So what I can also do is download the snapshot and analyze it in Visual Studio. And that's one that I did. I stored it before on my machine. If you download such a snapshot, you get a .diag session file, and you can open it in Visual Studio. And what it will give you is a mini dump, including some memory information as well. It will include symbols of your application if you publish them with your application, and you get this. I can now debug, for example, my managed-only application, and I can see where the exception happened. That's pretty amazing, right? I can also see that the exception was because the value cannot be null, and I can look at whatever values that I had in there. So I get a bit of information. Now I think, because I'm logging the user here and my user is null, I think that's going to be the reason for this exception. So by just enriching my data again, I get a lot more information. I get all the information to find my exception, but now I also have information about the actual exception, including a memory dump and things like that. So that's really interesting. Now, how do I add that to my application? There's a few things that you have to do. So first of all, you have to install one additional NuGet package, and that is this one, the Microsoft Application Insights Snapshot Collector. Once you have installed that one, you have to do a little bit of configuration where you have to add the snapshot collector to your services, and that's pretty much it. So it's not a lot of configuration, but you have to do a couple of things. What you will get in this NuGet package is a couple of additional files. Let's open them in Explorer, or not. Jesus. I'll open them here. What I will get is that my application will contain, when I deploy it, a few additional files. There's first of all the snapshot holder process and the mini dump uploader. Whenever an exception happens in Application Insights, what will happen is that the snapshot holder executable is launched by Application Insights. This one will create a shadow copy of your running process. That shadow copy will be used to create a dump and collect all the information that the debugger wants to have. And then the mini dump uploader will be invoked to upload that snapshot into Application Insights. If you try this and it doesn't work immediately, delete these files, reinstall the NuGet package, and it will start working again, because I found Visual Studio sometimes holds a lock on one of these files and it doesn't really work if you want to try it out. But that's pretty much what the snapshot uploader does. So again, not a lot of code to add, but again, I get a lot of value from what the service does with the data that I send to it. Right, on to the next thing, enriching telemetry. Why would you enrich telemetry? What would you want to do? Well, maybe there's some data that I want to add to all the properties that I send to Application Insights. Imagine I'm building a multi-tenant application, and I want to track which tenant the current user is working on. Well, what I can do is enrich my telemetry with adding one additional property, which is the current tenant that my application is running for. Maybe I want to obfuscate some information. I don't know if you know this, but there's a new law coming in a month in Europe, the GDPR, which basically states that you cannot store sensitive data unless the user consents to it, and if it's really needed for your application. Well, some of that information is, for example, email addresses, usernames, full names of the user, and so on. By default, Application Insights doesn't know that you are sending that data to it, so it may end up in there. Maybe you want to enrich or actually make your telemetry poorer in those cases by withholding some data that you don't want to send off to a third-party service in this case. How can you do that? There's two ways to do it. One is by just adding data on your telemetry client. We've already seen that that thing is around. The other one is by using the telemetry pipeline, and I'll show you how you can do both of them. So we have seen in my stream here, if we look at a number of the requests, I'll click faster than it can load. We've already seen, if we look at some of the samples, that the details contain a lot more information. So for example, there's always the fact that I'm in developer mode. That's metadata that Application Insights sends itself, but I'm also adding the current developer. Could be interesting to find my specific error message that I'm developing with and separate them from other users and other developers in my team. How am I adding this developer? Well, by simply sending it on the current telemetry client. So I'll show you how you can do that. In my services, in my application, where is it? Yes, in my application, I'm adding two middlewares in ASP.NET Core. Those have nothing to do with Application Insights. I'm just adding middlewares. Why? Because I want to intercept every request that goes through ASP.NET MVC Core here. What I do is I created a context enriching middleware. And what this one does is it checks if I can get my telemetry client from my IOC container in ASP.NET Core. And what I do then is just add a property saying the developer is Maarten. That's all I am doing here. And by doing this and adding it into my ASP.NET Core pipeline, I'm adding this to every request that comes into my application. It's one approach, but I don't think it's the best approach to add additional data. The other approach is by extending App Insights itself. So what I can do if I go to my configure services, I can also add my own Application Insights telemetry processor. You can create your own, it's kind of like a middleware approach in App Insights, where you can get access to whatever is going to be sent to Application Insights. So what I have there is a synthetic source telemetry filter that I created. It's a class that I made. It implements iTelemetry processor. And what I can do is implement the process method and do something with the data that I'm about to send to Application Insights. What I can do is, for example, check if I have a bot or a spider coming into my application. I don't want to know about this traffic in Application Insights. So what I'm doing is, if my current operations is a synthetic source, Application Insights contains a list of spiders and bots and so on that may hit your application. If it's a synthetic source, I simply say return, and no data will be sent for this specific type of request to Application Insights. If, for example, I want to say on my operation, the name of the operation, if it's equal to get the root of my application, I can do something like this, then I will not send that data off to Application Insights. This runs right before the data is being sent, so you can enrich the data at that point in time or choose to not send the data at all. So that's quite interesting. If you do want the data to continue, it's like a middleware in ASP.NET MVC. You should say next.process and the next middleware or the next item in this pipeline will run. I'm enriching here or filtering data. What I can also do is filter certain properties. So I have a GDPR telemetry processor where for the URL user/profile, and in my application the profile will typically be something like this, where I have my username in the URL. I don't want to send the username to Application Insights because that's private information, and according to this new law, I shouldn't just share that information with Application Insights. So what I'm doing here is when I'm processing it, I'm altering my telemetry. I'm casting it into a request because I want to filter requests. I'm not interested in dependencies like my SQL Server or API calls that I'm making. I just want to filter when it's a request. When I have a request, I will obfuscate the URI. I have a helper method where I check if the current operation name equals the ones that I specified in the top of my class. If that is the case, I'm sending a new URL, which is just a bogus URL, something that contains obfuscated in the URL, instead of sending the real data. The nice thing about that is I can still search in Application Insights for views of my profile page because I know what my obfuscated URL looks like, but I can no longer see this username in the logs there because I'm not sending the username. I'm changing the value in my telemetry pipeline. So that's also something that you can do there, removing data. Right, there's one more, and I think then we'll be out of time. Application Insights Analytics. We've seen we can send all this data to Application Insights, and they have a lot of views, a lot of charts, a lot of alerts that I can configure to get information back and get alerts from Application Insights. There's also a tool, Application Insights Analytics, and it is a query engine on top of all the data that you put into Application Insights. Microsoft created this internal tool for them named Custo. And Custo basically allows you to dump lots of data and then do some automated Spark and Hadoop kind of queries on top of that data. And they created a query language that instructs this Custo to get data. So for example, I have a data source requests. I can get a request from the last 24 hours. From those requests, I want to create a summary of the countries and regions that my users are in. I want to have the top 10 of them, and then I want to render a nice chart of that. Well, if I enter this query in Application Insights, I will get a nice view like this, where I get that information. You have all the data sets of all the data that is being sent to Application Insights, so I can query traces, events, page views, requests, dependencies, exceptions, metrics, all those things. I can query single tables, but I can also join those tables. So if I want to find requests that had an exception, I can create a join statement that joins those two data sources together. Then I can do filtering, grouping, projections, and all that. If I have one of those, I can then render either a table or a nice chart that I can use in a dashboard. So let's have a quick look on what we can do there. So if we go to App Insights, I can open my analytics, and they give you a number of sample queries that you can run. So for example, if I want to get the top 10 countries by traffic in the last 24 hours, I can run this query. I can see what the query looks like, and I get back the data. This was a query that ran over a couple of million data points from the past 24 hours. I can expand this and say I want this over the last 48 hours. I can run the same query and I will get data over the last 48 hours. Free format, I just create a query on the data that I have in there. I can do this on requests, I can do this on page views, exceptions, etc., whatever I want to do. Now, one that we at our company are interested in is, for example, the performance of people pushing NuGet packages to our service. Well, I can create a query for that, NuGet push performance, where I check my requests, where I want a request from the past 7 days, let's maybe say the last, well, let's say 7 days, that have the operation name pushing packages into our system. Then I want to summarize the performance by percentiles and then render a time chart. Let's run the query, data from 7 days, a couple of billion records, and I get nice information about the average time it took to push data to our application. One interesting thing is that also in this query engine, App Insights will recognize outliers in the data that I have. So you can see there's a couple of really big peaks in performance there. Well, it shows this purple arrow, and if I click that one, it will generate a query for me to figure out why this outlier could be there. It's not the truth, but at least it gives me access to figuring out what that outlier could be. And in this case, if the analysis finishes at some point, where is it? Come on. I should be able to see why this specific request was slower than others. And I know because I looked at this one before the session, it actually gives the region as being Korea. So I think the bandwidth was just ridiculously slow, and that's why we have this one outlier of sending the data into our system. But again, App Insights helped me to discover that, and now I know that maybe we need a new deployment in the Asia region to help speed up that specific user. Looks like this is not going to happen anytime soon. But anyway, I hope you get the idea. I can query the data, and even there, we can get automated analysis of why something happened. So it gives me back the query that made this thing happen, and as we can see, it's because the client was far, far away from our server. So that's kind of cool. Right. I didn't show you a couple of things. I only concentrated on web applications, but rest assured, if you have a Xamarin application or you're building an Android application, you can just use the same SDK and send data specific to your application type. I didn't show you sampling. That's a really interesting feature in App Insights where you can say, okay, I'm only interested in 20% or 50% of whatever happens in my application. Because maybe you have so many requests, so many log events, so many metrics and so on that you want to track. Maybe you are just interested in enough data to analyze, but not all data. And that's what you can do with sampling. We can do release annotations where whenever you do a deployment, you put like a timeline or a marker in the timeline so that you can see, are we doing better or worse than our last deployment? That's also something that you can do. One that I didn't have the time, or well, that was kind of funky to get set up, is also a profiler. We've seen that we can debug or capture a debug snapshot when an exception happens. We could also get a profiler when some interesting thing happens and we want to get that information. So those things, if you're interested, you can test them out. So in conclusion, logging sucks. Remember, don't do stupid strings. Have a look at Application Insights because it gives you the service where you can collect and analyze all the data that you push into it. But also look at the SDK because you can enrich and make it really better and tailored to the application that you have. If you want dashboards, if you want to run custom queries or custom alerts or whatever you want to do with that data, you can use Application Insights Analytics and dive into the data sets of everything that you are sending to it. With that, thank you, and I think you have some more information about what's going on next doors.